Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Lois Palin, and I am the Senior Director at the Center for Security Studies at UMGC. Welcome to our October Cybersecurity Awareness Month activity. And just to let you know that October Cybersecurity Awareness Month is held every October, and it's a collaborative effort between the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which we call CISA, and the National Cybersecurity Alliance, NCSA. And we do this to raise awareness about the importance of cybersecurity and to ensure that all Americans have the resources that they need to be safer and more secure online. The University of Maryland Global Campus and my department, the Center of Security Studies, are proud to be champions in support of this essential online safety, awareness, and education initiative. The overarching theme for 2020 is do your part, hashtag be cybersmart. And now, more than ever, the theme empowers individuals and organizations to own their role in protecting their part of cyberspace, with a particular emphasis on the key message for 2020, which is if you connect it, protect it. So today, I'd like to introduce Ms. Helen Nelson. She is an IT security office at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And her presentation today is going to be about risk-based security control assessments for the federal information systems. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Lois. As Lois mentioned, I am one of the IT security officers at NIST in Gaithersburg, Maryland, headquartered in Gaithersburg, Maryland. I specifically support the Office of the Director at NIST. I perform and conduct IT security control assessments, including privacy assessments for applications, services, and systems with which we use government data, among other things that I'm responsible for as IT security officer in that role. I'd like to thank UMGC for this opportunity for providing this presentation to you all. I'd like to talk a little bit today about IT security control assessments, how at least in the civilian federal space, how the National Institute of Standards and Technology performs these IT security control assessments, and the drivers for the requirements for these assessments. So this morning, I'd like to talk about some of the key U.S. government laws and regulations that, as I mentioned, that are driving the IT security and privacy requirements of systems, applications, and services used with government data. We'll also talk about the role of NIST in implementing and promoting these requirements. We'll also talk about the what's actually in scope of what we need to assess per government requirements. We will also dedicate some time in discussing assessment of cloud-based services, including those that are contractor or vendor provided services that either use their own servers or put the organizational data in the cloud. We'll also touch on some of the other standards and frameworks that are currently in use in other industries that could also be leveraged by federal agencies for their own internal assessments. I know at NIST, when we perform our security control assessments, we don't have to do the assessments from scratch on our own. It's actually preferable that the company that we're assessing has already had some type of independent or third-party evaluation that they've done, and then we assess that package. And last but not least, we'll cover some of the takeaways from today's discussion. So what are the IT security requirements for protecting information on federal systems? Where are all these requirements coming from, and what are these laws and regulations? So the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, in particular, its Circular A130, has always been thought of a one-stop shopping document, if you will, for OMB policy and guidance on IT management. So A130 is something that was published by the government and includes specific guidelines that require all federal information systems to have security plans. How are federal agencies securing their systems or applications and the IT-based services that they're using? A130 also includes guidelines that require systems to have formal emergency response capabilities. And it also requires a single individual to have responsibility for operational security, like the chief information officer or the chief, actually it is a CIO and not the CISO or the chief information security officer. The responsibility per A130 actually rests on the chief information officer of the organization. A130 also includes Federal Management and Fiscal Integrity Act reports to Congress be made with regard to the security of their systems. It also requires security awareness training for all government users and administrators of the systems. And also it requires regular review and improvement on contingency plans for those systems. And those are just a few of the things that A130 requires. It's a huge, like I said, a huge one-stop reference resource for what's actually driving all the security requirements for federal agency systems. A130 also establishes official policy and guidance on IT management for federal executive agencies based on laws like the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980. There's the Klinger-Cohen Act. There's the Privacy Act of 1974. There's Chief Financial Officers Act. There's so many other ones. There's the Computer Security Act of 1987. There's the Government Paperwork Elimination Act of 1998, and on and on and on. So there's a slew of laws that support the OMB A130. A130 also has an Appendix 3, or one of the appendices is called Appendix 3, which also talks about, which covers more details about the security requirements and what's actually mandated from federal agencies. There's the eGov Act, or the eGovernment Act of 2002. And why this act is important is because FISMA, or Federal Information Security Modernization Act, was actually enacted as part of that act. And FISMA was enacted to, quote unquote, provide a comprehensive framework for ensuring the effectiveness of information security controls over information resources that support federal operations and assets, and also to provide for development and maintenance of minimum controls required to protect federal information and information systems, unquote. So FISMA is a huge, a big act or piece of law, and it's definitely one of the key, if not the main law that we at NIST follows, because all of our processes and procedures related to security and privacy are based on our compliance with the law, which is FISMA. FISMA was first enacted in 2002, and then it was updated in 2014 to become the Federal Information Modernization Act. So originally, when it was established in 2002, the M part of FISMA was management. And then in 2014, when they updated the law, it became modernization. So basically, FISMA applies to all federal government agencies, state agencies that administer federal programs like Medicare and Medicaid and student loans, It applies to all U.S. private sector firms that support federal programs, sell services to the federal government, or receive federal grant money. So basically, in a nutshell, FISMA requires the implementation of security controls that use a risk-based approach. And we'll talk about risk-based approach to security control assessments in a little bit. The primary framework for FISMA compliance is NIST Special Publication 853, which was published and continues to be maintained by NIST. Within NIST, there's the Information Technology Laboratory. So basically, organizations that demonstrate FISMA compliance are awarded what we call an authority to operate, or ATO. You'll hear me say ATO throughout the presentation today. So companies that demonstrate FISMA compliance are awarded an ATO, or authority to operate, from the federal agency that they're doing business with. And that ATO applies only to that particular agency. If a company has contracts with multiple federal agencies, they have to obtain an ATO from each one. So the logic behind this is because every federal agency has different data security needs and vulnerabilities, so different controls may apply. A FISMA assessment then may be performed directly by the agency granting the ATO or a third-party security assessor. And we'll talk about security control assessments in more detail. The risk management framework is the name of, it's just the name that we assign any structured approach to implementing high security on any IT system that's used by the federal government, including those of hosting providers. It's actually an update to the certification and accreditation model that was used previously by federal agencies and security contractors. So basically, certification and accreditation is certifying that your systems are actually meeting security control requirements based on the risks in the organization. And then accreditation is the actual issuance of the ATO, or the authority to operate. So the CNA is now known as assessment and authorization. So CNA is now ANA. ANA stands for assessment and authorization. So CNA in this case is actually not obsolete. It's just it's now been changed to a different acronym and name. The risk management framework is a crucial component to meeting the requirements of FISMA. Its core tenets are derived from reports from NIST and also the Committee on National Security Systems, or CNSS. And in framing the security in terms of risk, we follow 6 steps. Determine the category through an impact analysis, so we can figure out what risk category a system and its data belongs to. We choose the security controls, and that tells you what security mechanisms are needed at a minimum. And then you can adjust and bolster the controls as appropriate. And at NIST, we actually call that tailoring the controls when we do an assessment, because not all the security controls per 853 would apply, which makes sense. Each system is different. Adopt the new tools. So we analyze the controls, we install the tools, and then we keep records of everything that we do. And then we analyze the controls to make sure that they've been installed adequately or implemented appropriately, and that they're successfully performing the function for which they were selected. We then confirm the risk presented to the environment with all the security mechanisms implemented, and we verify whether it's acceptable for authorized use or authorization. And then after that, we continually monitor through our annual assessment activities per FISMA we monitor the system as time goes on through assessments, ongoing analyses, and notations of changes. So at NIST, we note that these core 6 principles or steps of the RMF provide a nutshell understanding, while the specific rules and standards issued by NIST offer a more granular view on assessments and controls. So those are just some of the drivers of why we do IT security control assessments for our systems. So the types of assessments that we do, so there are 2 types of assessments in general. We have 2 general buckets, compliance-based assessments and then risk-based assessments. The compliance-based assessment, as it may already imply, it's regulatory compliance. Basically, it's an adherence to whatever law exists or the regulations, standards, guidelines, and any other specifications that are relevant to that company's business. So the risk of non-compliance may be associated with civil punishment, either through regulatory penalties or possible tort action as a result of negligence, due to a general failure to comply with those requirements. Let's see, typical compliance requirements include legislation such as the HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And then we have industry specifications like the payment card industry, or PCI compliance. You might have heard of that for companies that do collect credit card payments and things like that, and processes those payments. And in some cases, there may be a risk of criminal punishment too, with compliance-based assessments, such as with the Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX Act. So that's a compliance-based, very rigid, very kind of night and day, black and white type of thing. The risk-based approach is FISMA, and that's what we do at NIST. It's more strategic, it creates more value, and it's pretty predictive in terms of, but anyway, so compliance-based versus risk-based, I think that's the important part that we have to talk about. What is one type of assessment better than the other? So compliance and risk management, they're closely aligned actually. Compliance with established rules and regulations helps protect companies from a variety of risks, while risk management or risk-based approach helps protect companies from risks that could lead to non-compliance, which is a risk itself. But ultimately, both compliance and risk management help companies maintain their stability and integrity on a variety of levels. Actually, a company can't really have a robust risk management without compliance. So one can't really live without the other. So, and vice versa. However, see, there's a however. Their differences are worth noting because compliance-related activities and tasks and risk management-related activities deserve unique approaches and execution tactics. So some of the ways to compare compliance and risk management are, we have to think about, okay, tactical versus strategic. I mentioned that the risk-based approach offers a more strategic way for a security assessment. Then there's prescribed versus predictive. So compliance is more a prescribed approach, while the risk managed approach is predictive. So the prescriptive nature of compliance and the predictive nature of risk management explains why the former, compliance, is more tactical and the latter is more strategic. With compliance, companies have to adhere to rules and regulations that are already in place. With risk management, things are less reactive. at least in our view, it should be able to forecast the impact that the risks will have on the organization. Siloed versus integrated. So that's another difference between the two. So compliance tends to be more siloed, a siloed approach to security, while the risk-based approach is more integrated. Compliance is often driven by a siloed compliance department or siloed initiatives in various departments. And while compliance processes certainly benefit from broad transparency, they can survive without it. And conversely, the most impactful risk management programs cannot perform in silos. So we tackle compliance and risk management with different approaches using the same technology. And despite the differences between the two approaches, the right risk management technology can actually address both. So in conclusion, I think we've talked about these two types of assessments more than sufficiently. Compliance and risk assessment, there are definitely differences between the two. And I just think that businesses need to be careful to not lump the two together as one initiative with one approach. However, understanding their similarities and how to align the two is equally important, and because that would allow you to reap the benefits from compliance and risk management being in sync. Okay, so I think I did mention actually that FISMA is a risk-based approach, so definitely not compliance. So now, more on FISMA. It's a risk-based approach. It's definitely not a pass-fail approach to IT security. Basically, at NIST, we have what we call authorizing officials that weigh the residual risks versus the risk to the agency of exposure. Again, it's not a pass-fail approach to IT security. Risk-based decisions are made in the security authorization process. And when security controls are provided to an organization by an external provider, I mentioned, when an agency works with a contractor or a vendor and they have a contract in place, the agency has to ensure that the data or the information needed for the authorizing official is made available by the provider. More on that on a later slide. I have a couple of slides that are dedicated to contractor provided services that are used by the federal government. I also mentioned earlier about scoping of controls, and that's a risk-based decision, and it's based on impact and compensating controls. The application of scoping considerations can remove unnecessary security controls from the initial security control baselines and help to ensure that organizations select only those controls that are needed to provide the appropriate level of protection for the information systems. So at NIST, when we do our assessments, we tailor most of the controls because not all the security controls per 853 would apply. And that's especially true for what we call low impact applications, meaning they don't process anything particularly sensitive as far as information is concerned or government data is concerned. So we do a lot of scoping. And that actually makes our assessments a little bit more straightforward in that we don't have to deal with 200 plus security controls to assess and test. We could tailor the controls such that only those that are applicable are assessed. So very different from compliance-based, right? Because compliance-based is, you have to check the box and make sure that each box is actually followed or implemented. But with FISMA, it's a risk-based approach. It depends on the risk that you have. If you don't have that risk, you don't have to So there's more flexibility that's afforded. NIST's role. What is the role of NIST in implementing all of these IT security requirements for security control assessments? I mentioned earlier that NIST develops IT security guidelines and recommendations for the entire federal government in the civilian space. DoD and the Department of Defense has their own for classified information. So we're not touching on that. So we're talking about data, government data used within the civilian federal space. NIST is a non-regulatory agency that is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and its mission is to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. So that's right off of our website, the mission of NIST. And NIST has many responsibilities. So in the field of IT security, among many of its other responsibilities, like I mentioned earlier, NIST promotes information security standards for the federal government, and those standards are outlined in a series of publications. So you'll hear me say, or you have been hearing me say, special publication 853 or special publication, another number. So with 853, that publication outlines security controls for information systems, federal information systems and organizations, and documents the controls for all federal information systems except those designed for national security. Federal agencies must comply with NIST guidelines and standards within 1 year of the publication. So every time we update 853, it will be put out for comments to the private industry and other stakeholders in the community, and we get those comments back. And it's a long process for finalizing each update.
Helen, while you're mentioning that, someone had a question about what's the latest progress with the version 5 of the special pub.
Good question. Thank you for raising the question. NIST 853 Rev 5 is actually finalized, and it's out. It should be out on the NIST.gov website. Please do let me know if you can't find it, and I'll make sure to get that to you. But it was very recently communicated to us that Rev 5 was already out. In fact, one of our colleagues in the Information Technology Laboratory presented about Rev 5 and what's coming down the pike with Rev 5 a few weeks ago at an ISSA chapter meeting. I hope they recorded that so I can hopefully share that with the person who asked the question. But yes, it is out. Rev 5 is out. It was it was a journey trying to get that finalized. Big differences compared to Rev 4. So please make sure to watch out for those changes. Okay, great question. Thank you. And see, I'm trying to see where my train of thought was. Yes, NIST plays an important role in the FISMA implementation project. That project actually was launched in January 2003 and produced the key security standards and guidelines required by FISMA. And those publications include FIPS 199, or the Federal Information Processing Standards 199, FIPS 200, and of course the 800 series. So that's a little bit more like by way of background about the FISMA implementation project. And again, to kind of summarize what the top FISMA requirements include, agencies are supposed to keep an information system inventory. So every federal agency or contractor working with the government has to keep an inventory of all their information systems, which makes sense because if you don't know what's in your inventory, how can you secure it, right? You can't secure anything that you don't have. So first is identifying what those are, or those IT assets. Also, the organization has to identify the integrations between those systems and other systems within their network. So system inventory is one. Another requirement is categorize the risk. So organizations must categorize their information and their systems to ensure that sensitive information and the systems that use it are given the highest level of security. So, and I mentioned about security plans earlier. So FISMA requires agencies to create a security plan, and it needs to be regularly maintained and kept up to date. It's supposed to be a living document. It should cover things like security controls that are implemented within the organization, security policies and procedures, and of course, a timetable for the introduction of additional controls. So if you have a new component that you're putting in the security plan, like a new system and another application, make sure that the security plan is updated accordingly. And then, of course, we mentioned security controls. NIST 853 outlines an extensive catalog of suggested security controls for FISMA compliance, and there's a lot of them, a lot of controls. FISMA doesn't require, so I say that, but FISMA doesn't require an agency to implement every single control, and I think I've said this. Instead, they're instructed to implement the controls that are relevant to their organization and systems. So once the appropriate controls are selected and the security requirements have been satisfied, they can, or actually not that they can, they must document the selected controls in their security plan. Risk assessments. So risk assessments are a key element of FISMA's information security requirements. 853 offers some guidance on how agencies should perform those risk assessments. Risk assessments should be three-tiered to identify security risks at the organizational level, the business process level, and the information system level. And I mentioned certification and accreditation earlier, which is now authorization, assessment and authorization. So FISMA requires program officials and agency heads to perform annual security reviews. So it's not a one-time thing. You have to do these assessments every year because changes happen to IT infrastructure so that we can make sure that the risks are kept to a minimum level. You can never get rid of risk. They can only be reduced or mitigated or remediated. Federal agencies can achieve FISMA assessment and authorization through a process that includes initiation and planning, assessment, authorization, and continuous monitoring. And at NIST, when we perform our assessments, it's very important that we do the continuous monitoring every year. At least, actually, it's at least once a year. So you can do it, you can feel free to do it more than once a year. But nobody does that because, there are other things that people have to do. Just, being honest. But yes, the annual frequency, the frequency of once a year is the requirement. And again, RMF, the risk management framework, the ever famous RMF. I'm going to mention another special publication here. It's the NIST Special Publication 837. And that covers the RMF in more detail. So if you want to refer to that document, again, it's a publicly available document on the NIST.gov website. It talks about a systems lifecycle approach for security and privacy. And that publication was developed by NIST to further its statutory responsibilities under FISMA. And as we kind of touched on earlier, NIST is responsible for developing the security standards and guidelines and is consistent with the requirements of OMB Circular A130. So we're going, see how all the requirements are interrelated with the federal laws and regulations. It goes back up, goes back down. I want to touch on the ATO process that we do at NIST. So this is specific to NIST. Each agency can have their own type of internal ATO process in terms of assessing and authorizing their own systems. I just wanted to say that at NIST, our authority to operate process strives to implement the tenets of FISMA, and it applies to any system, application, or service that we use with NIST data. So The first question I ask our folks whenever they introduce a new application or system or a cloud-based service is, whose data is it, right? Because if I don't want to say we only care about it if it's NIST data that's being stored, collected, or processed. But if NIST has any vested interest in that data or how that system is supposed to be secured, we're responsible for making sure that appropriate security controls are implemented, are adequately protected to protect that data. And more on that in the next few slides. Actually, before that, I kind of want to talk about my last bit. I promised about the system, about the RMF. I've been honing in on the RMF because that's such a driver for what we do in terms of how we're assessing and authorizing our systems. It's this framework, the RMF, risk management framework, that's so important. And as I mentioned earlier, 837 discusses how the RMF is a framework that takes a systems lifecycle approach for security and privacy. That is so important because you don't want to incorporate security and privacy, until, just to the very end of, when you're developing a system or application. It has to be integrated and incorporated from the get-go. So the tasks within the RMF are closely aligned with the ongoing activities in the SDLC process, or the systems development lifecycle process. That's to ensure the seamless integration of security and privacy protections into systems and taking maximum advantage of the artifacts generated by the SDLC processes to produce the evidence that you need in authorization packages so you can facilitate risk-based, credible decision-making by the senior management in organization. So if you're an authorizing official making this determination about whether or not to issue an ATO on a new system, you want to make sure that security and privacy controls were implemented in every step of the way, not just during design phase or testing and things like that. It has to be from the very beginning. And also, it's a good point, I think, for me to make that all systems, regardless of which stage they're in, and this includes systems that have been operational for, decades. And then, of course, we have systems under development and systems that are undergoing modifications. All of those systems are in some phase of the SDLC. So security and privacy incorporation into each one of those stages are paramount. The initiation phase of the SDLC is the first phase. So defining requirements is a critical part of an SDLC process, and it begins with that phase. Security and privacy requirements are part of the functional and non-functional requirements allocated to a system. So those requirements are incorporated into the SDLC simultaneously or at the same time with the other requirements. So without the early integration of security and privacy, there may be a significant expense incurred by the organization later in the life cycle to address those security and privacy concerns that could have been included in the initial phase or design. So when those requirements are defined early in the SDLC, ideally, the resulting system would have fewer deficiencies and therefore fewer privacy risks or vulnerabilities or security vulnerabilities that can be exploited in the future. And I know this sounds like, a promotion for the RMF, which, as an employee at NIST, I'm a big fan of the RMF because it's a big part of what I do. It's basically our Bible. But integrating security and privacy requirements into the SDLC, I think, is the most efficient, effective, and cost-effective way to make sure that the organization's protection strategy is implemented. It tells a company that it can ensure that security and privacy are not isolated from the other processes that's used by that company to operate and maintain their system, supporting ongoing functions in the business to support their mission requirements. And in addition to incorporating security and privacy requirements into the SDLC, the requirements are integrated into the program, the organization's program, and the planning and the budgeting activities, to help ensure that resources are available when needed and project milestones are completed. So it just makes the entire enterprise architecture have a central record of that integration within an organization. Okay, I think that might be my last slide for the RMF. So let's talk about what actually needs to be assessed. I mean, I mentioned we assess at NIST, we assess systems, applications, and services that we use. So that's exactly what we do, or that what's actually in scope. Systems, applications, and services, including services that are in the cloud. More and more, especially in the current pandemic situation where, contracting with vendors that provide all of their services via the cloud. And I think I heard at one point that, once you put some type of data in the cloud, it's pretty much out there. You never really know where, you have no idea where it is. You just know it's out there and you can retrieve it, but you don't know where it is. So it actually needs to be assessed. Those locations, systems, application services, including cloud-based services, contractor and vendor provided services that collect data on behalf of the government. This is very important. And this actually became a bigger issue for us because we would have contracts that are not considered IT contracts, but the contractor would be collecting data on behalf of the government. So it's a government contract, which means NIST would be responsible for that collection, even though it's not NIST actually collecting. I wish I could tell if that makes sense. But from your perspective, but if your contract says the contractor provided services, the service is collecting data on behalf of the government, even though it's the company collecting the data, the government is still responsible for that data. And I've heard people say, well, it's not really us collecting the data, so I don't know how it would be our responsibility. Yes, it's in our contract, but we don't have the data. The responsibility rests on the agency administering that contract. And it's the agency's, and that it's that agency's responsibility to ensure that relevant and appropriate contract clauses related to security and privacy are included in that contract to make sure that the contractor or the vendor abides by those clauses. And you can hold them to that. So it actually needs to be assessed, also includes contractor provided services that include use of their own IT. So again, it's not the federal government's, let's say, web-based application that's used, right? But it's the contractor's own internal application that's being used. Again, that's within the scope of a FISMA review. FISMA includes that. We have to make sure as an agency that the use of that application is appropriate, and that application has all the security controls needed to protect the data, commensurate to the risk. So basically, the whole goal of the security control assessment is to give a good idea, to give authorizing officials a good idea on a given system, right? And so that in turn they can make informed decisions on the risks that are inherent in that system. So when I develop an assessment security report, of course, I would have the findings. I'd have the findings. I identify all the vulnerabilities and some metrics related to risk. But the so what? is, or the answer to the so what question in the authorizing official's mind is, what's in it? What risks am I accepting? And so there's a section in the report that would identify all the risks that I would recommend that the authorizing official accept. And again, it's all based on risk, right? So, and then the ultimate decision for the authorization is coming from the authorizing official. We merely make the recommendation. Assessing cloud-based vendors. I don't know how many times I have heard, well, the contractor uses AWS or Amazon Web Services. Amazon is a very reputable company. I put my stuff in the cloud or in AWS, I should be good, right? I don't have to do anything. I wish that were the case. When we do security control assessments of contractor provided services that use AWS or other it doesn't have to be Amazon. There are other very big cloud vendors out there like Amazon. And it's what's actually good about companies like Amazon is that they're also very serious about their security, and they know what federal agencies who are equally serious about security are looking for. So they know whenever NIST comes in to do their assessment, they have to have their FedRAMP package or their security control package that they've put together, that includes their security plans, their risk assessments, their contingency plans, and results of vulnerability scanning. So things that we look for. But a contractor using an AWS instance, let's say, because they have buckets in the cloud, like they have an S3 bucket and then all these other things in the cloud that are AWS, Amazon specific technologies. We still have to look at how the contractor is securing their own IT that they're put in that cloud. The cloud, Amazon, in this case, Amazon is just providing a hosting service. So it depends on what they're offering, right, to the contractor and what the contractor is using. Amazon has so many services. Amazon Web Services, provides a hosting platform, provides a file sharing service or services. They have backup capabilities. I mean, you name it. But it's still up. We still have to look at the contractor side on how they use those services. It's not enough for me or for me as the assessor, if I were the one assessing in this case, it's not enough for me to just look at, oh, they're good. They're using AWS. Oh, there you go. Recommendation to the authorizing official is, issue an ATO. That's not quite the case. We have to look at both how the contractor itself is securing their own IT that they then use with Amazon or other cloud vendor, and then we go from there. And it's all part of what we end up or ultimately recommend to the authorizing official as to create this big picture, if you will, of all the risk that covers all the bases. So in terms of other frameworks or standards that are out there, when we work with a contractor to assess their system or their application that NIST uses, one of the first questions we ask is, well, have you done an independent or third party assessment of your own? Because some companies do that. They have, they perform their own continuous monitoring activities. They scan their own system, so they know what vulnerabilities are inherent in their own systems, and they do them regularly. So some companies, are very serious about making sure that their systems and applications are secure. Not everyone uses or utilizes NIST 853 or FIPS, or because it depends on the business that they're in. So if they're in the credit card payment industry, it might not make much sense for them to follow 853, although there are there will always be some applicable controls if they take the time to comb through the catalog of controls. So, but there are other frameworks that would be applicable depending on the industry they're in. For example, in this slide, I mentioned the payment card industry data security standards, or PCI DSS. That's one of the third-party audits that we frequently obtain or receive from vendors that we work with, because they would say, well, we don't have an ATO or authority to operate from a federal agency, but we do have this PCI DSS that we maintain every year. Is that enough? We take whatever they give us as far as whatever independent assessment they might have done, and then we do, as part of our internal ATO process, we assess the vendor or the IT that we're using from them against other relevant controls per 853. So whatever assessment packages they might have done for themselves, for their own infrastructure, we leverage those packages as part of our own internal ATO process. Another framework that companies frequently have or follow is the ISO 27001 or 27001 International Standards Organization. It's a great framework. A lot of controls overlap with 853, so that if a company has had an ISO audit and it's a recent audit, so see, it's not enough that they've had an ISO audit. It has to be within the last year, or more recent. Otherwise, it's useless to us. So that's another good one that we ask for. And then there's FedRAMP. I'm kind of going backwards here from the bottom of the list, going up, but that's okay. FedRAMP is actually the General Services Administration's framework. See, another framework, right? Not a non-NIST framework. FedRAMP, specifically addressing cloud-based services used by the government. So anyway, fedramp.gov is a great resource if you want to find out more about cloud-based vendors that have been approved for federal government use. And of course, there's the DFARS. I don't know a whole lot about the DFARS since I'm not in the DoD space, but that's another framework that's out there. And I see I'm watching the time and I think I'm running out, but I'm on my last slide. Here are some takeaways. And then we'll get to questions. So continuous monitoring for FISMA compliance provides agencies with the information that they need to maintain a high level of security and eliminate vulnerabilities in a timely and cost-effective manner. It's important to remember that FISMA requires agencies to provide security protections commensurate with the risk and magnitude of harm resulting from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction of information collected or maintained by or on behalf of the agency. So this includes services which are either fully or partially provided by another source, including agency hosted, outsourced, and other cloud-based solutions. Any vendor, and I know I've said this in a previous slide, any vendor who stores, accesses, or can access, touches, manipulates, etc., government data must be fully assessed against all applicable controls. And again, you don't have to assess against all the 200 something, controls in the 853 catalog, only those that are applicable. And that's where scoping comes in, is which ones, you get to identify which ones are most applicable to your assessment. Considerations with assessing security of cloud-based vendors. I mentioned including security and privacy related clauses in contracts with vendors. So if you know that the contractor is planning to put your data in the cloud, another cloud that they don't have 100% control over, make sure that you're covering those in the contract. Make sure you have relevant clauses. Make sure they have third-party independent security assessments done and regularly. It's not a one-time thing. They have continuous monitoring performed every year, at least once a year. And another issue is incident response, right? If how will the contractor notify you in the event of a possible data breach or other incident? How will they interface with your team? Like if you have your own incident response team and something happens to your data, are there notification procedures um, established? Will they share logs with you or your team? Is that in the contract that they have to provide those, or give those up? Not give those up, but share those with you. And I mentioned continuous monitoring. You need to validate continuous monitoring via whatever artifacts that the vendor might have. So anyway, that's the end of my last slide. Thank you. Hope this was useful.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you so
I will
much.
turn it over to Lois.
Thank you. This was very helpful. I think, as you know, I've been a member of FASEA, the Federal Information Security Educators Association, for quite a while, and I'm always hearing about FISMA and RMF and everything. And you just put it in such a very concise presentation, so I really appreciate that. I think we have a time for a couple of quick questions. One question came in was. Do these requirements, so there's a lot of federal stuff going on here. Do these requirements actually change when administrations change? All of us have elections on our brain. So do
Mhm.
the change in administration affect these regulations?
Some of the laws and regulations do get amended. They do issue amendments to existing um, laws and regulation. FISMA has not changed at all since it was established in 2002. I mentioned in my presentation about FISMA about it having been updated in 2014 after it was established originally in 2002, but that amendment was not part of any, as far as I know, that amendment was not done in response to administration changes or anything like that. It was just to um, make sure that, first and foremost, the word management became modernization, and it was an improvement to FISMA. And actually, it even bolstered what FISMA covered in terms of security and the drivers for security for federal information systems and applications. Um, so key laws like FISMA, Privacy Act of 1974, Computer Security Act of 1987, those things, to my knowledge, have not changed at all with the changing administrations. Great question. If you go to the whitehouse.gov, though, you will see memoranda that have been archived under the Obama administration. So, because I was looking the other day and researching for this presentation about a particular memo that I knew existed at one point. And then when I Googled it, it took me to the archive section of the whitehouse.gov. So it may not be an amendment to an existing law, but as administrations change, they do tend to archive presidential memos issued related to security, but they still apply. And you can still obviously Google them. Yes.
And one quick question that people, once again, are concerned about in their lives. When you talk about cloud-based services, someone is asking, does the US federal government have a way to view cloud-based services?
I'm sorry, the last part I think I didn't get
The
the
US,
last part.
does the US federal government have a way to review the cloud-based services?
Yes. So I mentioned about FedRAMP earlier. GSA I know more and more cloud-based services are being used even more so now in this environment. But GSA was proactive. General Services Administration was proactive in developing this framework for um, assessing and authorizing cloud-based services that are in use by the federal government or within the federal government. So I'm blanking out on when FedRAMP was actually established, but yes, there's another framework, kind of like the risk management framework specific to just cloud-based services and cloud-based vendors and how they implement their controls. But with all of these other frameworks, like we mentioned the risk management framework, FedRAMP, all those stem from FISMA. They all come from the same thing. And it's just, I guess, in this case, GSA's interpretation of FISMA and how those controls should be implemented by contractors and in the private industry, and to by vendors who provide services to the government. But yes, the answer is yes. So there is a way, and it's through that framework developed and established by GSA, General Services Administration.
That's great. Thank you so much, Helen. This was very, very informative. I wish we had time for more questions. One of the things I really would like to delve into, and maybe we'll do another session on this, is how you became an IT specialist. What was your career path? And that kind of fits into some of the presentations we've had about getting into the cybersecurity field. One presentation we had talked about the very technical path, and this sounds more like a management and policy path. And that's really something very exciting that I think a lot of people don't realize, that you can get into cybersecurity without having that strong technical path. So if anybody has any questions about that or any other follow-up questions, please feel free to send them to our email, css@umgc.edu. And we appreciate it. I want to respect everyone's time. So, this year's main effort was to encourage all Americans to take proactive steps to enable lasting and positive cybersecurity behavior at home and at work. And today, I think we had a lot of insight into what the government is doing to protecting us against cyber threats. And this is to serve as a constant reminder for the need to promote cybersecurity awareness across the nation, because it's really a shared responsibility for the entire American community. So sign up to enjoy. We have one more webinar this afternoon about video conferencing in this era of Zoom, and we hope that you can join us with that. All of our exciting and engaging webinars have been recorded and will be on the CSS website in the coming weeks. So we've had webinars that would provided you with the tools you will need to do your part to hashtag be cyber smart in today's world. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Lois. Thank you, everyone.